Professor Rahul Tripathi. So, Dr. Rahul Tripathi is a professor of political science at D.D. Koshambi School of Social Sciences and Behavioral Studies, Goa University, where he has taught and researched since 2000, later serving as a head of department. His teaching and doctoral supervision spans international relations, India's foreign policy, international political economy, South Asian politics, and human rights. He has held academic leadership roles including member of Academic Council and University Court, chairman of Board of Studies, president of the Goa University Teachers Association, alongside visiting position at Nihon University, Japan. Naval War College, Goa. Associated with Election Commission of India's sweep survey for Goa, he has designed an online course on democracy and electoral management in 2022. He has authored and edited books including Monetary and Payment Cooperation in South Asia and Towards Freedom in South Asia, publishing widely on regional cooperation and foreign policy. I will now invite Professor Rahul Tripathi to take over the session, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Anand. Since you've already declared that this is going to be a mind-boggling session, the stage is already set. Uh, I mean, you've asked a person from Goa to moderate a session where there are three Delhi stalwarts sitting. So it's literally a David and Goliath situation. Uh, but I'm extremely happy. I'm extremely happy that I've been given this chance to moderate this very important session. Also, because Goa has been handling the issue of democracy for the empowerment of marginalized as per the mandate given to us in terms of thematic report that we are writing. So I hope to learn a lot from you and then take it back to my report. We have a very, very engaging and interesting panel before you, starting with Professor Anupma Roy. I would just like to bring in their first title, their affiliation, and what struck me most about their work. So Professor Roy is at the Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and she began her career in citizenship studies and political anthropology. And when I look at her work, particularly in the domain of gendered citizenship, mapping citizenship in India, dimensions of constitutional democracy, and citizenship regimes, law, and belonging, particularly in the context of CA and NRC in India, I'm pretty sure that Madam must be one of the most sought after authors in this area. We also have the presence of Dr. Chandrachud Singh, whom I'm seeing second time because I saw him on TV last night. He's a professor at the Department of Political Science, Hindu College, University of Delhi. He has had wide-ranging assignments, one of the most interesting ones on Prime Ministers of India at Teen Murthy. He has been the principal investigator on post-colonial narratives of gender-based violence, worked on a number of projects focusing on grassroots party membership in India. And at present, he's co-editing The Modern Guide to Cosmopolitanism. So pretty wide range that he has in terms of his work. He's a very well-known face on national television and also writes a lot in the national media. Last but not the least, Dr. Amna Mirza, with whom I can relate to more closely because of your work on international political economy. So she's currently based at the Shama Prasad Mukherjee College, University of Delhi, Department of Political Science. Her scholarship spans digital transformation, Industry 4.0, international political economy, and international relations, comprising so many books and research papers on these themes. And she holds the patents granted by Government of India and directs the ISSR-funded project on women, AI, and agriculture. So for us social scientists to have a patent, this is something which is indeed very, very unique. So we must learn a lot from you. So you've received honors, including the Springer Nature Top Cited Book Award in 21-25 for digital transformation, AI, and society. So it's really a fascinating mix that we have. So we have people who not only specialize on theory, but they specialize on the intersections of theory, policy, society. I need not say why the theme itself is very important. What is democracy if it does not include? So democracy and inclusion, I think, have to go hand in hand. And to put the entire thematic in perspective, I think we already had a very interesting first session. It's my pleasure to invite first Professor Anupma to please come, and maybe 15 minutes each, and we would have a Q&A towards the end. So over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. This is fine, right? Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you, Anand, Professor Chanchal. And this is a wonderful opportunity to speak among an audience, which is somewhat different from what I'm accustomed to speaking with. I would be, while addressing the theme that has been given to me, I would be relying on some work on the Election Commission that I've done earlier in a co-authored book with Ujjwal Kumar Singh. And I would be trying to present a conceptual framework within which we could perhaps begin examining questions of inclusion. And since we are talking about democracy, it's perhaps worth our while to think about democracy as an unsettled concept. It's a concept that is referred to as a deeply contested concept. And when we talk about concepts as being essentially contested, we are basically talking about not just disagreements around concepts, but we are talking about what these disagreements actually lead up to. And what they lead up to is a philosophical elucidation of concepts, because if we are in disagreement, we talk about those concepts more. And also because these concepts, particularly democracy as a concept, sets up an evaluative and appraisive framework within which we can map different democracies on the level of the intensity and degree of democracies that they have achieved. And when we talk about democracy and its constituent components, deliverable is one additional component that the IIDM has added to our repository of talking about. So what we are achieving and preserving, while we are talking about achieving and preserving democracy, we are also talking about what exactly democracy can deliver, and if possible, deliver through the electoral domain. Now, in entering the topic through the lens of inclusion, what we might want to confirm and affirm is that inclusion or democracy is perhaps the most appropriate form of government within which the inclusion can be achieved. And when we talk about inclusion, especially in an unequal and diverse society like India, it becomes important to also look at the constitutional frameworks within which inclusion has been addressed, or the problem of inclusion in diverse and complex societies has been addressed. And I think it is for worthy reasons that one can think of the constitutional framework as transformative, because it looks precisely at these inadequacies in democracy that need to be eliminated through policy making. And therefore, the Indian constitution, quite like the South African constitution, which was a template for the transformative constitutionalism that we have in India, looks at the way in which socioeconomic transformations can be done in a society that is unequal. Now, in the domain of electoral democracy, and we must remember that when we talk about electoral democracy is an essential component of democracy, but it is not sufficient. So, but electoral democracy is something that definitely needs to be preserved through free and fair elections in order for other thresholds of democracy to be achieved. And in this particular presentation, I'm going to look at representation and citizenship as two lenses through which we look at the problem of inclusion in diverse and complex societies, diverse and unequal societies like India. And representation particularly is quite a fragile kind of a category in the Indian context in particular, but also in other contexts, where representation has to make itself, it has to actualize itself through a speech form, no? And voting is what I would call a speech form, is a speech form that has been recognized by the Supreme Court of India as the voting. The Supreme Court of India said that voting is a speech act, and in a 2002 judgment, which you would be familiar with, the PUCL and ADR judgments, where the Supreme Court said that when the citizen votes, voting is an act of speaking, and in order to speak intelligibly, the voter must be informed. So the judgment came in the context of the contest over disclosure of information of candidates, and the informed voter would be an uncoerced and unfettered voter. And this is something that the first Chief Election Commissioner of India, Sukumar Sen, was also seized with. And his problem was different from the problem that the ECI faces at the present moment. In the 1950s, the Election Commission of India, 1948, March 1948 onwards, when the first electoral roll based on universal adult franchise started being prepared, the problems that the Election Commission of India was facing was different from the problems that it faces right now at this juncture while preparing the SIR. At that moment in time, there was no precise law to guide the Election Commission on how to prepare the electoral roll. The only authoritative framework that the Election Commission could address or refer to was the draft constitution. And that's where the preparation of the electoral roll drew its legitimacy from. So while its first chief election commissioner was seized with the anxiety of doing something in the absence of law, as we move along historically, we see other chief election commissioners talking about something different. It's not the electoral laws that they are concerned about, even though electoral laws are important to guide the way in which electoral administration should be done. For them, it's important to also see, and I'm particularly talking about CEC SP Sen Verma. It's 1967, and 1967, as political scientists don't see that as a moment of rupture in Indian politics, as a political space and electoral competition gets pluralized, and there is a way in which the Congress system is breaking down. And here, SP Sen Verma starts talking about not just the act of voting, which he says is important, but more important is the fact that there should be a deliberative space within which this act of voting would make sense. So the act of voting will not make sense unless there is a deliberative space that is generated through what was then an incipient model code of conduct, and through the entrenchment of a moral code within which political parties could function. It is that space of speech that would assume primacy rather than the act of voting. Now, there are two ways in which the problem of inclusion can be addressed. One is, no, I have only 6 minutes, right? So 7 minutes, right? So one way in which the problem of inclusion can be addressed is, and inclusion in a representative democracy, for we are a specific kind of democracy. We are not an older form of democracy in which everybody, every citizen was participating. In a representative democracy, there is a distance between the citizen acting as a voter and decision making taking place at a spatial hiatus, right? So there's a distance between the voter and those who take decisions. And therefore, the problem of inclusion would be twofold. One problem is how to bridge this gap between this act of voting and the taking of decision that happens at another space altogether. So there is a problem of bridging the spatial and temporal hiatus between the voting act and the decision-making act. And a lot of people who look at the problem of inclusion say that the development of an articulated speech space, a public deliberative space, is important. And this space is not something that should be there only at the time of elections, but between electoral trials. So there's one electoral trial, another electoral trial, and these two electoral trials would be bridged through an articulated public space of deliberation in which there is speech. The other way in which the problem of inclusion is addressed is through looking at not the question of participation through the public space, but through the question of exclusion. Who is it that is being excluded from this public space? Because the public space itself can be an hierarchical space that makes disadvantage and discrimination explicit. So the problem of exclusion is something that one needs to always address. Now, in one of the ways, there are three distinct ways in which I think, and some of the research that we've done in this area seems to point in those directions, which is historical as well as contemporary. One is the question of procedural certainty. Now, there has to be procedural certainty, and this is a principle of electoral governance that all of you know who are training to be people who govern elections or study electoral governance. Procedural certainty is important for the outcome, which would be democratic. So you don't know, there's no certainty of outcome, and uncertainty of outcome can only be possible if there is certainty of procedures. And certainties of procedures was something that, again, I go back to the example of the preparation of the first electoral roll, where there were no procedures, no precise procedures of preparation of electoral roll, and therefore CEC Sukumar Sen says that perhaps the outcome is not as satisfying as he would have wished to, but he was satisfied because that was the most that the ECI could do in the conditions that obtained at that time. But there is another dimension to the preparation of electoral roll, the first general electoral roll, which, if you're familiar with, and if you're not read it, perhaps do read the book by Audit Shani, How India Became Democratic and the Preparation of the First Electoral Roll. It's an entire book on the preparation of the electoral roll. And one of the arguments that Shani is giving in that book is that it is through the process of preparation of the electoral roll, in the absence of an electoral roll based on universal franchise, that a notion of Indianness and democratic nationalism was inculcated through contestations, disputes, etc., at the local level. And both those who wanted their names inserted in the electoral roll and those who were preparing the electoral roll got mentored into democracy. So what was important was the entire process, and the first electoral roll as an exercise of enumeration of an adult voting population was a different exercise of enumeration. We are familiar with different kinds of exercises of enumeration, including SIR. We are familiar with Aadhaar, we are familiar with census, but none of these enumeration identification exercises compare to an exercise of mapping the voting population, because mapping a voting population is an exercise which is not for the affirmation of governmental power of the state. No, it is for unleashing popular sovereignty. So it is, the electoral roll therefore needs to be looked at differently. A second point quickly is a point about the the entire act of electoral governing elections is an exercise. It has a moral component. It has a moral component, as the DG himself talked about in the morning, and Professor Chandrachud also referred to. A moral component is about self-reflexivity. It's reflexivity, knowing what's wrong, what's gone wrong, right? And having the ability to correct it. And that is something that we see that the present ECI is standing on the shoulders, tall on the shoulders of stalwarts who've gone, or election commissions that have gone before the present ECI or present CEC. And the recording of what has been done, or narrative of preparing narratives of elections, not in terms of an administrative record, but in terms of what were the problems that were being faced and being transparent about it. So something that is in the history of the ECI. So if you were to look at the narrative reports, etc., I think that record of administration is something, as a record of moral responsibility, is something that needs to be done. A third is in terms of innovation, and Professor Tripathi is here, and I think that he'd agree with me. The DG referred to the scale on which the ECI is working at present, and the scale is a complex scale. It's a difficult scale, but the way in which governance happens at the local levels and the innovation that takes place at the local level through voter education and awareness programs like this, like the sweep, which bring about a convergence in electoral governance of the local administration, the resources that are available locally, and the way in which this proximity and familiarity in a non-coercive format over a period of time enables, and some of these, the particular sweep that we studied for our book in Riyasi district, there was almost a 50% increase in voter turnout from 2009 to 2014. And it was not because voters were deleted from the list, right? They were because voters were added to the list. And the way in which the sweep programs present themselves as innovations is increasing gender vote ratio, gender role ratio, increasing electoral population ratio, epic role ratio, etc. So I'm thinking, instead of perhaps talking about large scales, if one was to talk about specific local context where over a period of time in a situation of familiarity and intelligibility, these activities of the Election Commission can be carried out. And in these local formats, they can be inclusive. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry if I've taken time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, ma'am, for sticking to the time. We'll have a lot to talk about the sweep program. In Goa, the challenge for us was that we reached 82%. How to reach 83? So varies from place to place. So I have the pleasure of now inviting Professor Chandrachud Singh for his presentation.
Thank you, Professor Rahul Tripathi ji, Dr. Professor Anupama Roy ji, Chanchal Bhai, Amna Mirza ji, many of my young friends here, and many of those who are connected through the cyberspace. It's really a great moment for me, for I'll be presenting before you some random thoughts that I've developed. And that's also primarily on account of the magnanimity of the Election Commission and IIIDM in particular to involve me in their project, which is an ongoing project. I think the theme itself is quite intuitive, reimagining democracy for the future. Normally, academics like us, we look back at things, how they have happened, we analyze them, precise them, and we try to build up some kind of understanding from what has happened. But at times, framing something which is very forward-looking is very persuasive, because it allows us to envision something of future and maybe possibly put a roadmap for uh, realizing it, for achieving it, maybe a roadmap on which not only the present, but perhaps the possible future generations could travel. And I think, I don't know what was in the mind of the organizers, but I'm reminded of a similar exercise which a great economist called John Maynard Keynes undertook. And he did that in 1930. In fact, he spoke somewhere in 1928, and that was published in 1930. So almost 96 years ago, where he wrote an essay which was titled Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And he was writing in 1928-30, hoping what England would be in 2030. And there he was writing in the backdrop of the slump of the post-Second World War period. And he was hopeful that perhaps that slump was, kind of a temporary thing, and perhaps England would recover and maybe do very well. And perhaps he thought that perhaps his grandchildren would look at questions, and humanity itself will look at questions which are larger questions and perhaps having larger purposes. Now, whether if he comes back, if he were to think about it, it's a different story whether those larger purposes we are thinking about it right now or not. But I think this reimagining democracy for future is kind of a similar exercise. Interestingly, 1950 is when India starts its democratic march. I mean, an independent democratic march in 1950. Look at the world around in 1950. It's a world where citizenship, and if you know about T.H. Marshall's work, which is the sequential spacing of rights, it's Marshall's understanding that it's only in the 20th century that citizenship comes a full circle in terms of granting of the social welfare rights. I mean, one can say that democracy as an idea is quite, can date back to eternity. But the fact of the matter is, democracy as we see it now, we experience it now, is also a product of the 1950s, because it's only the granting of social welfare rights which made citizenship effective and which made democratic governance a bit more realistic in terms of what democracy was supposed to deliver. As Anupama ji also said, that perhaps the most essential component of a democracy is also the trust and resilience and the fairness of the electoral process, because in the absence of that, that might lead to a lot of turmoils in society. So democracy is a wide concept, but electoral fairness is also an important part of it. But for that to happen, the autonomy of the citizens to come, I think social welfare right is also a very important thing. So 1950s is perhaps a good time to start with, because it's a time when citizenship as a concept and in terms of granting of rights, not just civic and political, but social rights is established. It's a time when citizenship in terms of substantive rights is established. It's also the time when the Indian Constitution is being framed, and it's also the time that the head start to the electoral democracy in India is made, as Anupama ma'am also referred to, an exercise in faith, because the first election commission, remember, didn't have a census data in hand. And therefore, the election commission was working in kind of an exercise of faith, which effectively, when the census data did come, there were around 70 lakh people who were the difference between those enumerated on the voters list and the census was around 70 lakh people. So the point is, and then, in fact, one could also go back to the Constituent Assembly. Even there, the principle of accommodation and inclusion was quite evident, given the fact that it was a largely Congress-dominated body, and yet you had views and opinions and shades from different ideologies and different kind of traditions. So what I'm trying to say is that perhaps if we look at India's democratic experience, or perhaps India's democratic march, the first election, before that the Constituent Assembly debates, the framing of the Constitution, the global atmosphere about substantive rights and at least the need of it, and which also got reflected immediately in the tussle between the judiciary and the parliament in terms of granting of making of directive principles much more realistic. So that effectively is the kind of framework in which one needs to understand why democracy survives in India. I mean, one could go back to Lucian Pai's argument, which he did make in 1966, where he says post-colonial democracies have to navigate a lot of crisis in order to become resilient. And he says, well, participation, integration, legitimacy, distribution, penetration, these are some of the crises that post-colonial democracies have to navigate. And I think India may not have scored very high on all these parameters, but we did reasonably well. And because we did reasonably well, democracy has continued to be resilient and has continued to survive, and not only survive, but become more stronger over a period of time. So the point is, if we had to look at democracy and inclusion today, I think there are 2 points that I would need to make. One, democracy and citizenship both are ideas which keep evolving. The democracies of 50s is different from the democracies that we live in today. And I'm sure in 2050, again, there will be some more additions to it. And that's basically because beneath that citizenship and democracy is the idea of equality. I think equality, remember, recall Tocqueville's famous argument on equality, where he said that equality is something which continues the march forward and one cannot halt it. Halting it would be to stop the will of God. Remember, today we are much more equal than our yesteryears, and I'm sure in future we'll be more equal than what we are. So if equality as an idea keeps evolving, and equality in terms of how we manage equality, how we think of equality, if that keeps evolving, both democracy and citizenship will continue to evolve over a period of time. And that is why when we look at democracy in 2050, we would need to ensure how inclusive we are. We need to think about how inclusive we have been and how inclusive we can be. And what are the different ways in which we can think and design those systems by which we become more inclusive. Well, the fact of the matter is that understanding inclusion requires having a minimalist and a maximalist view. When I say minimalist, that's when we look at the demand side, which is where you look at the voters. Who is a voter? How do you ensure that no voter is left out? How do you ensure that the vulnerable sections of society get in? And again, I'm not saying that we have a perfect score to match up, but I think over a period of time, we have actually really done well. I mean, even the critics, the best of the critics of the present system would agree that India's democracy has both deepened and widened. I mean, we can share the data and we can prove that on certain parameters. If you look at 2019, 20, and 24, more women have voted than they ever did. If you look to the scheduled caste, scheduled tribe reserved constituencies, the voter turnout in those constituencies have been in sync with the national turnout as well. The ratio of the female to the male voters has also been increasing. Now, it's not to say that we have achieved a perfect score, but over a period of time, both, I mean, look at the rise of the OBC politics, Dalit politics, and all that. So, and now the demand of women's reservation bill as well. So over a period of time, from the voter side, there has been considerable progress that has been made in terms of inclusion. And I'm sure there would be more arguments in the times to come where more and more parameters could be designed and more methods could be developed to bring those people who are still left out, whether it's through SIR or whether it's through other mechanisms. And that's why I raised that question of 324, thrashing out the differences between 324 and possible differences, if any, between 324 and 326. But my concern is also on the supply side. And when we say supply side, that's where the understanding of ballot access comes in. And I think this is a very apt opportunity to talk about the supply side. It's not just, democracy is not just about the right to vote, it's also the right to contest. So when you say 5 more minutes, that's more than enough. So the right to contest is a very important right, because democracy presumes that everybody can have the right to fullest self-development, uh, and that requires, and if that would mean that I could also contest. But the fact of the matter is, if you look around, even in this hall, I'm not sure how many people would think that they have the capability and that they will contest. Because remember, they might think that they have the capability, but they also know that they are stymied by a lot of other things which require people to contest, or which should be there for people to contest. And I think this is where the supply side becomes equally important. I mean, look at it. The Election Commission recognizes political parties, and different countries do that as well. But the kind of recognition that we have through the ECI here is a performance-based recognition. So you need to have a certain amount of votes, you need to have certain amount of seats, and there are so many combinations that the ECI, comes up with for you to become a national party or a regional party. Now look at a party called NCPI, the Nationalistic Citizens Party of India. And it was an unregistered political party, but overnight it became India's #2 national political party. Now, performance, we've been told, and some of you would know this, many of us know this, that performance has to be gradual, it has to be procedural, it has to be systematic, and it has to be proven over a period of time. But that doesn't happen. But so when you look at the supply side, I think that's something that we need to also look into in terms of framing our understandings of inclusion. Similarly, if you look at the access that registered political parties have, or the national political parties and the regional political parties have in terms of communicating their ideas to the voter, the same access an independent candidate would never have. And which would effectively mean that you have to be into a national political party or a regional political party to effectively communicate with your voter. Now, this is where the choices of a voter also get limited, because the voters do not know. Remember, this is what ma'am just now said. Democracy means that the right to vote is the right to speak, and right to speak can happen only when you have information. And the information has to flow both ways. That does not happen, particularly because you are stymied with your resources, because you do not have access, because you don't have offices, you don't have staff, you have nothing. And therefore, the only thing that you have, and then remember, I don't, and I'm sure you know this, get into the anti-defection system, where it is the party leader. Remember, parliamentary democracies are known for legislative, the executive accountability to the legislature. But what happens? It is the executive which starts controlling the legislature, because if you don't follow the whip, you're gone. So which effectively reduces everything to kind of a very hierarchical system, which is an antithesis of democracy. But democracy is about choice, democracy is about liberty, democracy is about consent, democracy is about free speech, democracy is about equality. That does not happen there. And that is why it's very important that inclusion be looked not just from the angle of a voter, which is important, but also equally important that inclusion also be looked at from the supply side, which is how political parties are formed. The typical definition in my college days of a political party used to be, and that was classical definition by Edmund Burke, who would say that, well, a political party is a group of men assembled together for the purpose of achieving power on an ideology on which they all agree. This is Edmund Burke, not me. Now you please try and understand and try and declutter it and clutter it as you wish. to see what are the things which are prevailing, what are the things that we need to think about in terms of thinking about political parties. Lastly, one more minute. Lastly, I think, and as an optimist, I think India's democratic system is on the path, on the right path. We have, over a period of time, really come over, and we've been able to push a lot of hurdles aside. Today, democracy, as I said, has deepened, participation has strengthened, a lot of development initiatives are in place. I'm again saying we can agree and disagree on the kind of scores that you would give to these initiatives. You have the direct beneficiary transfers. You also have a lot of digital infrastructure in place. But I think we also need to just devote one moment on this ideal of what is called Viksit Bharat. Normally, people take Viksit Bharat as a dream of economic prosperity. I don't think we should think in those terms alone. We should think of Viksit Bharat in terms of inclusion. We should think of how the poor, the vulnerable, the farmers of this country, women, all can be brought into the mainstream. If that were to happen, boys and girls and ladies and gentlemen, if that were to happen, remember, India will be one outlier, and which we want India to be, as the only democracy in the world. And please add this. If we define democracy as universal adult suffrage, then India will be the only democracy in the world to have achieved the status of a developed state while being democracy. And that is a promise of peace and prosperity for the world, because normally people become really skeptical on that account. And so therefore, whether Keynes's grandchildren may have achieved the dream that Keynes had for his grandchildren, but I'm pretty sure my grandchildren would have achieved that status if we were really to do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Chandrachud. I wish I have a chance to invite you to Goa. So I would like you to give a much detailed lecture on this theme. I think the way you brought in Lucien Pai, the way you brought in Keynes, I think very fascinating. And
This is what political theory teaches you.
And it was so good that you ended on an optimistic note. I'm a student of South Asia. So much of what Lucien Pai said about Asia applies to many of these examples. And I also feel that no, at the end of it, we all have to be optimistic. Very, very fascinating presentation. So last but not the least, now, Amna.
Yes. Thank you very much, sir. And as I start, I must confess that I'm extremely excited with the good remarks coming from Chandrachud sir, pinch hitter, all that. But yeah, Professor Tripathi. All right. All right. All right. So being the last speaker, 15 minutes to my credit, and will try my best to address the topic that we have. To start with, Adharniya Professor Rahul sir, Professor Anupama ma'am, Professor Chanchal sir, Professor Chandrachud sir, esteemed audience, delegates, participants present here offline as well as online for this very important discourse that is going on, that how we get together to reimagine democracy. Now, as we reimagine democracy with the important pillar of inclusion, here we are talking about gender with respect to electoral democracy. Now, to start with, I would like to say that myself, Dr. Ramna, and this is a co-authored, a joint collaborative work with my students Nisha and Sonam, who are doctoral candidates at Department of Political Science, University of Delhi. So to start with that, when we talk about gender and electoral democracy in the bigger context of reimagining democracy in 2050, we believe that gender and electoral democracy have a mutually reinforcing relationship. Well, Anand, how does it go? The slides are not moving. So how the argument unfolds? Well, yes, working. So how the argument unfolds? So for the remaining 14 minutes that I have, the trajectory of the journey is that we would first try to revisit the concepts that forms the part of framing the concepts, then look at the theoretical debates also, wherein a lot of work has gone in, and from therein we'll also try to move towards the stage of evidence, where we're going to be looking at 5 country case studies with quota models, and of course deliberating on the big picture, that how does the concept of gender present an important perspective with respect to reimagining democracy. Now, when we try to visit gender and electoral democracy, both terms have a very important component, that is with respect to the space accorded to participation and representation. Gender, as we all know, that biologically we are all distinct, but yes, the biological construction definitely pours down with respect to the social construction that we are attached to with respect to being a man, women, girl, and boy. And these norms, behaviors, lifestyles, roles are just not delimited to the idea of binaries. Things have indeed gone more within the big picture of gender. Electoral democracy, it's a system that's based on representation and participation as twin pillars. Now, when we look at both gender and democracy by the bylanes of history, a lot of water has flown down the Thames. What we see here is that gender, which started, of course, there have been waves of feminism with respect to voicing out the need for inclusion of women, and this need of inclusion has to be seen in beyond the binaries, we believe, because gender issues are a quest for diversity, are a quest for respecting inclusive spaces. Gender issues need not be just delimited to the perspective of putting patriarchy with respect to any argument. So when we understand gender and electoral democracies, they are not separate agendas, but rather they have a mutually reinforcing relationship. Moving forward, now let's look at important perspectives concerning the representation and participation. Before me, Professor Anupama Roy ma'am, Professor Chandrachud sir aptly highlighted the issues concerning the maximal and the minimalist perspective, the procedural to the substantive perspective. So when we look at the issue of gender in electoral democracies, is it only about counting the heads? Is it only about reflecting on number of seats they have? Is it, or is it about understanding deeper churnings of power? Remember, power again has had multiple interpretations. So here, with respect to understanding academic debates on representation, of course, the realm of social science and political theory has a lot of work. But for the purpose of delimiting our review of literature, we picked up Pitkin's typology of representation, wherein there's a very important distinction with respect to the descriptive and the substantive representation. And this distinction between the substantive and the representative indeed today presents important questions for the problematic of gender to reflect on the contested realm of representation and participation. That is, does numerical presence alone create only appearance of equality, or true representation demands something more, that is looking for women's interests and not just looking like a population? And again, when it is about, for example, Professor Roy ma'am absolutely pointed out a very important thing, that voting is an exercise in speaking. So when we are speaking for the women's issues at large, does it only have to be women that speak up? Or perhaps it could be the men also that speak up for women's issues. So while we are looking at Pitkin's typology of representation, it's equally important to point out the corrective discourses wherein India has made an important attempt. For example, when we talk about representation, shouldn't be only about counting how many women exist in the state legislatures and municipal bodies. India made a very important corrective stance for world governance at large, that the idea of enumeration has to exceed beyond just the number of people existing in the house or so. One has to look at the important contributions that are taking place at the grassroots, wherein the idea of women-led development was put forward. Further, as we are looking at the issues of gender within the big framework of electoral democracy, the politics of presence also puts forward an important perspective that, though we believe that, yes, gender issues, though they stem up from the idea of looking at things from the binaries, but there's something more to that. That is, do we decode the language of putting forward the gender narrative only in terms of that are male leaders fully capable to understand and speak up for women's lived experiences? Because again, when we look at gender, the idea of mapping experiences is very unique to this entire project. And mapping of experiences, lived realities, it's again important to decode again when we talk about the problematic of issues concerning violence, care. Does it have similar degree of interpretation from the varied perspectives? And again, when we are talking about politics of presence, where gender adds to democracy, that is, it adds to the space of respecting diverse perspective and views. Further, when we are looking at the issue of gender for electoral democracy, the critical theory literature, the critical mass versus critical actors, indeed definitely add more that yes, numbers alone do not guarantee influence, and political institutions favor long established networks. Herein, of course, patriarchy works in a manner that favors male networks through formal rules and informal practices. So again, the critical perspective, the critical mass versus critical actors, indeed add more here, implying that we must look at the entry and the exit with respect to the issues concerning representation and participation in a deeper manner. Further, that there is no one uniform degree of a cause that we can attribute to marginalization or exclusion, because one form of discrimination is somewhere connected to the other. And this is where, again, the third wave of feminism adds more to the academic debates with respect to the issue of intersectionality. Then when we look at the last thing, that is, we looked at the feminist institutionalism and portfolio segregation. See, politics is always not just about settled games. Politics has a broader canvas wherein there is informal as well as formal mechanisms, and both have to be understood. So herein again, when we look at the power discourse, the entire distinction between hard power and soft power, that is, are women just concentrated at soft portfolios, wherein hard or perhaps having limited say of space in the hard portfolios? Now, with this academic review of literature, we'll move on to 5 country case studies: India, United Kingdom, South Africa, Argentina, Mexico. Now, of course, when we are there in comparative analysis, the very important focus is that we look at the models at a tangential level. Social sciences, every concept in social science is always contested. So when we look at models at a tangential level, we look at one aspect of similarity of comparison, and herein we look at the entry and exit at the municipal level. That do countries offer any specific space, any specific bargaining method for women entry and exit and space with respect to participation and representation? Now, when we look at India, we all know about the 73rd and the 74th constitutional amendments, which mandates the reservation. And of course, we have the 106th constitutional amendment also. But however, at the same time, it has to be factored in along with the next census and delimitation. That is, can we just reduce the entire representative exercise to exercising the mechanism for reservation on the current 545, or perhaps when we have the increase in number of seats also? Now, as we are looking at representation and participation, it is equally also very important to factor in that gender has its own multiple layers of interrogation. The concerns of women in the rural area are perhaps different from concerns of the women in the urban area. Moving forward, when we look at United Kingdom, yes, there is no constitutional legal quotas that exist here. Women's representation depends mainly on individual party policy. And of course, there have been, important attempts. For example, the Conservative Party has relied on mentoring and leadership program. And at the same time, one also has to look at the entire dynamics of gender and electoral democracy in the bigger context of working of the political apparatus. That herein we witness how the competitive Westminster system still limits women's influence. Of course, there have been gains on equal pay, family leave, amongst others, but they have been highly contested also. Moving forward, the next case that we looked at, the South African model, wherein with closed list proportional representation, allowing parties to place women directly into winnable position. Herein, an important aspect that how the African National Congress attempt to rise the quota from 30% in 1994 to 50% in the zipper system, altering one man, one woman in 2009. So women's representation in parliament now exceeds 44%, which is again a very important, remarkable step at the world stage. But then, even within this, the MPs, the women party MPs also, they depend on party leadership rather than voters for re-election. So then the very idea that how the dynamics of politics work in a manner that party loyalty often outweighs cross-party women interests. The last model, second last model, the Argentina model, wherein it was the first country to legislate a candidate quota, 30% under 1991, and with 50% gender parity law, all introducing altering zipper candidate list. But then again, it's somewhere worked in a manner that women were placed in unwinnable list positions, which were again somewhere, which was again makes a perfect case for ensuring that there is a need for equal placement reforms. Moving further, the last case of Mexico, we all know that there is a constitutional reform requiring 50% women reservation across the executive, legislative, judicial branches, local government. It has achieved nearly parity across every branch of the state, but yes, irrespective of the mandate, the legislative mandate, there are women who continue to face harassment, violence, exclusion from key decisions. So now, to sum up, what do the five cases, when we look at them at a tangential level, what do they present to us? India, yes, there is a reserved seat at the local level, emerging at the national level. United Kingdom, no legal quota, party-led voluntary measures. South Africa, closed list PR with 50% zipper system. Argentina, legislated candidate quota with parity law. Mexico, constitutional parity across all branches of the state. With this, we are now moving towards the debate. That's the third and the last part of our paper. Democracy 2050, how do we work on delivering on inclusion? When we look at gender issues, definitely things have to go beyond what actually exists on the paper. We all know that it's very important that numbers then are just not enough. Gender presents an important intervention in the entire democratic exercise that one cannot reduce the mechanisms of democracy to numbers alone. More women in parliament definitely does not always mean more decision-making power. That also puts an important thing for gender at large, that gender issues are just not about women alone. Gender issues are about a world which is based on which is sustainable, inclusive, and resilient. Just like when we are questioning women as the homemaker, equally we are questioning why should the idea or the perspective or the norm of a man should be that of a provider. So in that case, gender demands a very important degree of solidarity. Next, when we try to look at the hazy maps of power games within the five models, what we see here is that yes, power gap remains. Women are often excluded from key ministries and major decisions. And this is where indeed the dynamics demand a change. We all know that, yes, the issue of gender discourse has witnessed a transition from just talking about women empowerment to looking at the big picture of women-led development. And this is where we say that equal opportunities matter. Women need equal access to leadership positions and political resources, but this can be only factored in through a right collaboration of both men and women and of course other gender stakeholders. And yes, there is a need to look at things beyond the legislative mandates only. Yes, stronger safeguards are essential. Effective laws are needed to prevent proxy politics and ensure that women exercise real power. Further, when we are talking about delivering on inclusion, it is very significant that one must look at the transition to work on transition from procedural presence to substantive and equally map down the issues concerning intersectional inclusion. As Professor Roy also pointed out, that the narrative of, so say for that matter, enumeration, it must be worked out in right collaboration with the grassroots voices. So yes, sir, I'm right finishing. So Democracy 2050 delivering on inclusion requires that we must understand that gender and electoral democracy have a mutually reinforcing relationship. There is a need to work on mechanisms for broader mapping, procedural to substantive. Since both gender and democracy are concepts that they've had a history, they have equally evolved over time, and at the same time, there's no one settled definition. So, in this time, looking at contemporary times, wherein indeed information, which is one of the important pillars of how democracy works, of how concepts are reworked. So, in the era of digital age, where information is currency of power, in times of 4.0, we have to address the intersectionalities for a holistic overview and for an inclusive problem solving mechanisms. When we reflect on Democracy 2050, it's important to add an innovative perspective to the lexicon on women's empowerment, gender equality, democratic inclusion, amongst others. The Western narrative, of course, places the entire, definitely makes an important gives us an important yardstick to understand gender, from Mary Wollstonecraft to Simone de Beauvoir to amongst others. But at the same time, there's a need to go beyond the binaries. And this is where the Indian knowledge system on gender and electoral democracy would make a very interesting addition, as well as present an important perspective with respect to giving everyone an important pillar, giving everyone an important yardstick to navigate democracy in times to come. To cater to resilience, inclusiveness, and responsiveness, emphasis must be to situate gender issues from a new pivot. And as Professor Chandrachud sir rightly pointed out, the discourse of Viksit Bharat, wherein women-led development is going to play a very important role. That is, we have to look at acceleration of representative nature of democracy from just mere voting to looking at new formats of engagement, new formats of participation. That is how, in this aspect, our women as citizens are making important contributions. So an inclusive perspective on democracy gives an opportunity to respond to new issues of dynamic context. While navigating through political pipelines, it's also important to rationalize the working of realities. Yes, politics and its related mechanisms, politics and its related apparatus of representation are a gray concern. Rules of politics are never black or white. It's an area where we must reflect on that there are no settled rules, and within the absence of rules, there are gray realities. So, structural aspects of roles, stereotypes, perspectives, entry, funding, issues in the mainstream, agenda setting, working of political units are all part of the same scanner. So, to achieve gender balance, democratic apparatus has to be made mature to nuances of the context, becoming, and what more becomes more important in the context of Industry 4.0, that just mere legislative component, yes, indeed, it is sufficient, yet not yet not adequate enough to ensure a good outcome. So thank you so much, everyone, that you patiently listened to me. Thank you, Chair, for this great, kind opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I was only constantly reminding you that winning runs already have been scored. So you need not have.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
So I think it's been a fascinating session. I will have my 2 words towards the end. But in case there are any online participants, we would like to give them an opportunity to give their comments or questions. There aren't. So the floor is now open, because I think I can see quite a few youngsters here. Some might be students of Delhi University, some might be researchers. I think a very, very interesting range of issues have been thrown open for discussion here. And the substantive notions of democracy and the procedural notions. I mean, if there can be a thread which can perhaps link, otherwise it's so difficult to actually find a thread. So the thread which I have is that I think all the three have connected very well to the substantive versus the procedural. Whether one is talking about the whole idea of citizenship, whether one is talking about the conceptual level of inclusion or the gender dimension. So the canvas has been pretty rich. Any questions or inputs? There should be some. Otherwise, I'll ask the person responsible for getting us here to ask a question.
Yeah, Anand, you should.
Anand, why don't
Yes,
you
yes.
start?
Question mark, you got it right.
I am so much into organizing thing. I think I have lost my cerebral ability to ask questions. So, but I would just ask anybody one else to begin. I probably sir would be the best person to begin with, and then I would come.
I thought we were playing cricket, but here is dribbling going on. Yeah, something. Yeah, Spencer.
No, my question to the panel is, uh, if we have to identify certain strategic pathways to achieve an inclusive society, so what could be those strategic pathways? One, two, or three strategic pathways. So anyone can answer this. So this is what I'm interested in knowing how to achieve, because policies are made. There are ostensibly on paper inclusive institutions. There are policies for inclusion, and based on that, we can say that there are some policy outputs. But outputs are not outcomes. We have to reach from policy output to social outcome of inclusion. So what is the mechanism, what is the causal mechanism that can lead us to that kind of social outcome? So procedures remain, policies are there, but still there is not substantial or substantive improvement in the kind of inclusion that we would like to have in our society, or we can also say the kind of inclusion we can potentially achieve. So how to close that implementation gap, if you will?
I will ask the second. Now we can ask the questions. Recovering from the retired
Cerebral,
heart.
cerebral waves are over.
So my question is, sir Chandrachud sir in his presentation said that quoting Tocqueville said that equality is a march forward. So if we believe that equality is a linear way forward in as the Hegel also said that we reach to the end of history. So where we are saying that after, especially after Corona, we see that the whole discourse on equality, inclusion is reversing in some way, because people are saying state is back in big way, especially during the crisis. So how do you see the evolution of epistemology of inclusion, moving from here, especially when you see in the whole world there is a rise in special kind of democracies recent years. So I would like to comment on that. Second question maybe from the sweep. What are the other examples of Madam mentioned example of Riyasi very briefly. I would suggest ma'am could elucidate probably more on that, or some other example if she may have. That's from my part. Anybody else want to ask?
I'll be happy to.
So, I have two questions. One is for Professor Anupama ma'am, and then I'm Gunish Singh Alwalia. I am legal researcher here at IIIT. So firstly that, ma'am, you talked about the certainty of the procedure. So for any EMB to manage and conduct the elections. So what kind of certainty of the procedure you are talking about? Is it a totally rigid process or do you have a scope of discretion in that? Because in the past recent years, we have seen that the discretion has been created a lot of scope on the question of the legitimacy of the elections. Since example like the allotment of symbols, it is a very rigid process. The process is very much given, but still we have the issues like where the fragmentation of a party, which we have seen in Maharashtra. Other things can be the hate speech, where one can say that this particular speech can be a hate speech and others say that it cannot be. Secondly, my question is to Chandrachud sir. So you talked about the citizenship and inclusion. In past few decades, we have seen, not just in India, but worldwide, that the citizenship, the concept in itself, we are moving from inclusion towards exclusion. That means that the earlier provisions which talked about that how a person who is born in a particular territorial land is a citizen, or also included that his parents, where they might be citizenship of other country, he would automatically achieve citizenship of that country. But now we have narrowed it down that a person who is even born in a particular territory, even then he might not be a citizenship. There, how we are creating a situation that a person is being born as a refugee in itself. And in that sense also, he's not under the category of refugee in itself. So what do you have to say upon that?
I think we can take this round and then.
I will add another question. Yeah. So, ma'am, Amna ma'am talked about the women's reservation and going forward. So, 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment Act actually, substantially transformed the grassroots democracy where the women are presented and gender discourse in electoral democracy comes in mainstream. But how do you see, since we are talking about democracy 2050, and our parliament has already passed the Nari Vandan Shakti Act, a Constitutional Amendment Act. So how do you see it transforming the future of democracy in India, especially if you look at the picture in 2050 through the lens of gender? Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. And I'll begin with Chanchal's question. I was I'm bad at strategies, right? So I think more in terms of principles. So if I was to think of maybe, as you said, one or two strategies for achieving the goals, those goals would be normative goals, right? If equality is a goal, then now what is it that would lead us to equality in the best possible way? And I was thinking in particular about the way in which the question of equality, in the way in which it has been envisioned in the Constitution, gives a lot of scope, space, and power to the state to act in ways which are outlined in the Constitution itself. So if you were to look at the directive principles of state policy, the directive principles of state policy tells you what kind of the route that the state must take in order to achieve different aspects of equality. Now, one of the things that Chandrachud said about direct cash transfers, etc., and I thought that maybe when we think about strategies, direct cash transfers appears to be a good strategy, but a bad norm, right? So if one was to think of equality within the framework of citizenship that Chandrachud also talked about, and social equality as the domain within citizenship where equality would be achieved, right? That's the sequence that Marshall talks about. But Marshall also talks about social equality as the domain of citizenship where there are deep contestations between the social agenda of the state and capitalism, which is about the rights of corporates and not of citizens, right? And therefore, when one talks about rights in sequence, social rights in a normative sense would be rights that individuals would be able to achieve through political rights. And the bringing together of civil and political rights within the domain of social rights means that people are not citizens, do not present themselves as individuals, but rather as groups that can collectively bargain with the state to achieve those ends of social rights. So I'm trying to make a distinction between strategies that may be ad hoc and principles that would follow norms of social equality. And therefore, I would refrain myself from responding to the question of strategy and think about norms. So I'm sorry if I'm taking that kind of an approach. To Anand's question of sweep, so the specific field research that we did was in Riyasi. And one of the things that we realized in Riyasi was that no, this was an area which was specific. All experiences with sweep would be specific. Goa, as Professor Tripathi said, was a specific experience. Riyasi was also a specific experience because Riyasi was historically a location which was somewhat that an antipathetic relation with the larger political regime side. So historically, it was a somewhat of an excluded area. But all of a sudden, you see that parliamentary elections 2014, you see a double jump in the electoral roll ratio, etc., and voter turnout both. So the way in which the DC of Riyasi explained, and he also Riyasi won the PM's Best Practices Award. He explained to us as a collective activity to bring in more people who were displaced, migrated, or populations that were the Bakarwal population, for example, that had never voted because their life cycles and livelihood cycles were different from cycles of democracy. So how do you identify excluded populations and ensure that excluded populations enter mainstream politics? So there is a way in which both the indifference and antipathy of people towards politics was being addressed through the electoral governance process, right? Not the electoral process, but through governance. And there was a way in which the DC said that we use local resources, and local resources for the ICDS, MP Lads, Manrega, etc., to build also durable infrastructure that would make the electoral process accessible to people, right? And then this was only the big in one part of how we look at sweep. The other aspect is to also look at how people related to being part of this process. And so we attended a Jirga, and in the Jirga, people were not talking about the act of voting as something that was endorsing a regime. It wasn't an endorsement. It was an insertion into the political mainstream in order to in order to place demands and claims of what being a voting citizen would mean to a people who had voted with what they call jaddo jahat and shauq, etc. So our मेरी नस्लें जो हैं वो जो अभी deprived हैं उनको. So there is a way in which the entire political party relation with people, which is based on a patron-client relation, is displaced by a different kind of associational form, which is generated by through electoral governance. So that's the way, and this was something that he was trying to replicate also in Kathua, which we also so a convergence model that he said. the yeah, sorry. Yeah, sorry. So very quickly then, Mr. Ahluwalia. Yeah, so there is a lot of discretion that laws allow. Particularly, we saw that with the SIR, there was the discretion that the ECI used, which was available in the RPA 21.3, and said that there is a discretion that we have in order to think of a way which would deviate from what the RPA lays down in other provisions of 21. Now, the thing about discretion is that discretion allows flexibility, right? But discretion is not without any kind of regulation, right? No, it is also regulated by norms, and no, the norms that occupy a field of law that may not be explicitly stated in law, but there are conventions, etc., that occupy that space. So what I'm trying to say is that discretion gives space and flexibility to address situations that are extraordinary and exceptional. That's how the ECI described the situation. But discretion is also something that goes back to norms and practices and creates norms and practices that would be desirable for an institution to follow, right? So that's what I'm trying to say. So exceptional procedures would require addressing them through the use of discretionary power, but discretionary power cannot also be arbitrary and should use. And the examples that you've given is the way in which discretionary powers have been used, right? But what I'm trying to say is that discretion, so I would say, therefore, that when you interpret Article 324, which has a long jurisprudence, Article 324 is also about superintendent's direction and control. But if it was to be seen only as control, it would be a matter of interpretation, and superintendence and direction would be another direction in which powers can be seen, right? So I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but no, that's the only way I can think. Citizenship, you will answer if you think that you need to. Yeah.
Just 1 minute, because my question was to the panel, so maybe other members of the panel would also like to reflect on that. My use of the word strategy was in the sense of causal pathways, and it embraces rather than denying or excluding the role of principles, the role of values, the role of norms. So following from your discussion, my question would be, what are the strategies or what are the strategic pathways to establish the norms? And because for the norms to work, for the norms to have an impact, they must enter the discursive conditions of society. They must become the part of the dominant discourse, and also over a period of time must become a part of the informal institutions, which would then impact formal institutions. So that was my point, and hopefully if yes.
Okay. So, no, I think you are asking and raising a very important question. And normally, the answer that people would give to your question is very predictive kind of an answer, which we all as students of political science, and forget about political science, everybody knows. So people would come to you and say, well, if we have rule of law, if we have impersonal administration, if you have neutrality, well, everything will be all right, and that's the strategy forward. But I don't accept that kind of an explanation. I think, just to give you an example, if I am driving with my daughter who's in school, and if I try to, just drop something out of the car, she objects to it. But I have a host of friends who keep calling me, particularly when the admission session is on at the university, to tell me that, well, his or her son has not made it to the cutoff list, but can I be of help? Which is kind of an expectation that it can be done. So there is some kind of an understanding in the mindset of the people themselves that, well, in India, all this is possible. So what is the strategy, the best strategy ahead? And it will take time. It's not going to happen overnight. I will give you just one straight shortcut answer. Only and only if we are honest with our educational structure and system. It will take 20 years down the line to fix all that has happened wrong, that has gone wrong. It may take 25, 30 years, but remember, that's the only good thing that we can do to our country. That's the precise thing that has not been done to our country in the last so many years, and people of all shades and opinion have been responsible for this. That's one answer. The second thing about, I didn't understand what he said. Hegel never talked of a linear line of progress. Hegel's progress was zigzag. By the way, Hegel was a statist in that sense, because Hegel would want a state to be stronger. And in fact, that is what the state is there for. Not to be the stronger, but the state has to provide those safety nets. Because remember, if you start from a starting point which is heavily unequal, remember that's what unfettered capitalistic market system will lead to. It will lead to a lot of inequality. And that is where the state has to apply a lot of filtering mechanism to ensure that nobody is left out. The state does not necessarily need to put everybody together into a bunch of the kind of a socialist utopian dream, but the state has to ensure that nobody is deprived of that basic minimum guarantee which allows a person to live a life which is worth living in terms of being a human being. So I would rather say that not good that, but perhaps the experiences of the pandemic and so many exigencies teach us the lesson that we should not write off the state, as there was a tendency under the neoliberal system to simply write off the state. You'd see that in the second term of Manmohan Singh, and from there on, even in India, the state had become much more stronger. The rollout of the MGNREGA was primarily on that account. So I think the state should be there, has to be there to ensure that there are level playing fields, and perhaps those people who fall down at least get the basic minimum. That's the second part of your, that's the second question. And the last one was about citizenship. Normally we understand it as jus sanguinis and jus solis, right? So maybe by the soil or by the count of blood relations. The world that we are living in is a very different world when this whole idea of solis and sanguinis may have been, thought about. I think rather than looking into who's a citizen by birth and who's a citizen by relation, I think the larger question should be about, understanding that nobody should be deprived. And that deprivation, I think, or maybe the access to what in the cosmopolitan literature we always say, well, individuality, universality, and generality. Everyone, irrespective of who she is or he is, where he or she is, must have that basic income, not the basic income, that basic access to resources. So I would rather say that in a globalized world, this solis and sanguinis do not really matter that way. Yes, the states have normally, even India has now been more, aggressive towards jus sanguinis. But I think, citizenship is more a matter of choice, but the choices can happen only when, it's again back to the same, square where you make people more competent and capable enough to take on a call on that. So that would be my answer to your question. And I think there was another one on flexibility. And you said about the symbols. Well, there's a moral code of conduct, and I think that model still remains moral. I think it's also time to think about and making it a bit more legal in that sense, where compliances could be ensured in that way.
Right. So 2 minutes. So, Anand, to answer to your question, that would gender add more when we look at democracy in 2050? Well, there cannot be any rocket science when we talk about future. Yes, definitely, gender makes the political discourse much more innovative, but gender in itself is not sufficient. One has to map down the intersectionalities within which the gender issues overlap. And that's something very important. And equally important, it is to map down the engagement, the right percolation at the grassroots. Without right grassroots engagement or sensitization, any discourse or any talk about, or big talks about gender equality, gender empowerment, amongst others, would really be hollow. So important to factor in this bridge between theory and practice. Chanchal sir, you made a very important, I like that provocation on strategy, because it's very important to actually, bridge this thin line between theory and practice. So I believe that we've spoken a lot about substantive aspect of democracy. What is really required is a certain degree of right orientation with respect to the procedural aspect of democracy. Right now, there are countries that they're talking about earned citizenship. For that matter, if I give you an example of UAE, like if you are a good citizen, you have good professional aspect, they put you on a golden visa, right? And that's a new format of citizenship. Where in a lot of diaspora-oriented countries, they are so the golden visa that you get a citizenship or a residency for a period, a certain amount of thing with respect to the amount of inputs that you can bring in into the entire management affairs. But yes, the economics trumps the politics there in this setup. So in that aspect, it's very important that we must work on the aspect of training with respect to the procedural aspect of democracy. And within the same argument, it is very important to have a human-centric approach with respect to the engagement with AI algorithms. Algorithms, AI institutions, per se, they do not work on their own. It's equally important to reorient, train the grassroots with respect to engagement therein. For example, for a simple thing with respect to enumeration per se, I believe a lot of things, because we are living in a completely different time of TMI, too much information. A lot of things could have been made better, perhaps with a straight, efficient line of communication. So, yeah, one good strategy would be that in the era of TMI, it's very important to straitjacket and make the lines of communication much more efficient and smooth.
Thank you. Thank you very much. No, I would not even dare ask a question, nor would I make a comment. I think if the inaugural session of the 2-day conference has been so fascinating and so explosive, I wonder how the remaining sessions would be. So my request to
So I think, this is to conclude it. People were forced to ask questions. But my understanding is that when you don't have a question, it's not that bad. If you don't have question, there are two interpretations. Either people understood everything or they didn't understand anything. And as presenters, it's always good to think of the former, that yes, people understood everything. And because they understood everything, there's no question as such.
So my request to you, Anand, would be you are certainly going to be there till 2050. So you make sure that the the recording of this session is maintained till then, and then let's revisit what all was said and what is the distance that we have attained. So on that formal note and a very pleasant note, it was all said in jest. Yes, I know we all are hale and hearty. We all are smiling, and we'll continue to keep smiling.
And I just discovered you're only 2 years senior.
Yes, yes.
And there is
I
a
would now hand over.
very good lunch is waiting for each of us. And I guess it's time to go there.
Yeah.